Good day, familia. Welcome back to Bomba Live, the talk show you've been waiting for your entire life. Thank you so much for joining us. Subscribe to Bomba Live and go to podcast as well as on our YouTube channel and subscribe to Bomba Live on all of our social media platforms. On this very special edition of Bomba Live, if you're a big fan of late night talk shows or Netflix, like most of us, the writer's strike and what's going on in Hollywood has really caught a lot of our attention. And I wanted to bring someone on the show today that could really discuss kind of just generally how this issue, what's kind of going on in this labor situation, how that impacts the content that we're potentially going to be consuming or not consuming, sort of short and long term, and also kind of how does this speak to the bigger issues related to diversity in Hollywood, diversity in content creating, the sort of ever-ending struggle from a Puerto Rican Latinx perspective around just kind of properly being included in the entertainment industry and having our voices heard and our stories told in on all these platforms. And so, unlike the disaster that happened on the platform on another in politics, Twitter does have some redeeming qualities because without Twitter, I wouldn't have found this man. Let's welcome onto the show someone that's a Boricua that's very involved in the labor situation to support his fellow members of the Writers Guild of America en un taino de verdad de Jersey City, brother, Jorge Rivera. Jorge, welcome to Bomba Live, my man.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here, brother. And I want to
Yeah.
make sure I properly introduce you. You've had a celebrated career, not
Mhm,
just as the vice chair, it's kind of in your labor hat, as the
mhm,
vice chair of Latinx Writers Committee for the WGA West. You're a former true crime TV producer who produced People's Choice nominated hits like Betrayed and Twisted Sisters. Twisted
mhm,
Sisters was a favorite of mine. That was good stuff, brother.
mhm.
And Jorge now writes projects focused on fictionalized murders instead of producing stories of real ones. Has several TV projects that are currently, unfortunately, on hold through this whole labor situation. And again, really kind of one of the real strong, particularly on social media, one of the real strong Puerto Rican voices that's really giving people accurate and sort of on the ground real time information about the writers' strike. Jorge, welcome to Bomba Live, hermano.
Thank you. Hey, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
It's great to have you on here, brother. And again, I
Mhm,
encourage people to follow Jorge, particularly on Twitter. He's been really giving people a lot of great information. Later on in the show, he's going to give
mhm.
us some hashtags and some other uh, tips on how to kind of follow what's happening out there. So why don't we just start from the beginning?
Yeah,
Obviously, the writer's strike got a lot of fanfare when it began about 3 weeks ago. And, as things happen, people get distracted. But lo and behold, 3 weeks later, we're still in the middle of it. So why don't you just kind of catch us up, Jorge
mhm.
Rivera, one of our leaders at the Writers Guild of America, just kind of where the state of play WGA strike is at this point.
Yeah, yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I should say up top that yes, I'm a member of the Writers Guild for several years now, and I'm also the vice chair of the Latinx Writers Committee of the Guild. That is all absolutely true, and definitely involved in many of the actions that we're doing on the pickets. Uh, but I'm also not an official spokesman for the guild, so everything I say is my personal opinion, and although it's accurate, again, it's not the official stance from the guild because I'm not an officially ordained spokesperson. But that being said, yeah, the writers are on strike. It's been about 3 weeks now. We're finishing our third week. Um, Basically, the reasons why we're striking. So I guess let me backtrack a little bit. So the organization that represents all of the studios is the AMPTP, and I always forget what the acronym stands for. You can look it up real quick. It's something to do with producers and studios. We have a contract with them that expires every 3 years, and every 3 years or so, we go to the table and we revisit this contract with them. And this contract basically specifies all of the working rules around our industry for writers. The amount we get paid per episode, the amount we get paid weekly, the rules about around residuals, which is the money that we get paid for rescreenings of our work, after in reruns, things of that nature. Our how much money gets paid into the health fund. We have a very, very vibrant health insurance fund. So every 3 years we go to the table, and this is the first year in the last 10 years. Every 3 years, this is the first round of negotiations in the last 10 years or so where we're really going to the table with some of the big streaming organizations that have come into the ecosystem. 10 years ago, Amazon, Hulu, Netflix, Apple were not really that big part of the puzzle yet. 10 years ago, we were kind of in a very different model. The landscape, what it looked like at that time, was basically the old school studio models. You know, your Foxes, Disney's, ABC's, NBC's, Universal, CBS. Those organizations ran on a very different model, and the large majority of work that was being done was in broadcast still. You know, on regular television, where often those shows ran 22 episodes per season. You know, your cop shows, your doctor shows, lawyer shows, and your Lost, you know, the Losts of the world. Those kinds of shows were on a very different model. Like, so they ran mostly on broadcast and ran 22 episodes. So if you were working in that at that time and working a broadcast, you were on one of these 22 episode shows, you were working almost year round. That those 22 episodes kept you busy for almost the whole year. You maybe have a month off when you're on hiatus, and so you know there was a small majority of your HBOs and Showtimes that was more premium television, cable television, but that those weren't the majority of the jobs. And slowly over time, as the streamers became more prominent, the changes that they kind of brought to the table were eroding that landscape of 22 episodes, such that you know people were not working as much, not working as often. Um, Streamers were not paying residuals. So you know, I can go deeper dive into what the actual mechanics and the actual problems that arose were. But the short story is that those companies really changed how the business looked and how we were hired as writers. And over time, it became harder to sustain, you know, a living wage. Our, you know, our what you know, we started instead of 22 episodes, we were getting hired at 8 episodes a season now, which shrinks down the amount of time you're actually working. You know, instead of working all year long, you might be working 2 months out of the year, and so that cut down on your weekly paychecks and the amount that money that was being paid into your health insurance fund and the amount of money that you might generate from residuals if you got any at all. So the long story short is that that's what really changed the game. And so amongst other things, and I can go deep into what each of those big or the big issues are, but the long story short is that it's gotten harder to sustain a career, and this is the first time we're really going to the table with these companies, because the first time 9 years ago, they were just starting up. And then the pandemic was kind of a non-starter. We had a negotiation during the pandemic, and that was kind of a non-starter because nobody was working. So no one had any real leverage to have this conversation. But now this round, we're sitting at the table with them, and their sort of asks or their sort of like positions on things are a little bit different than the broadcast like companies. And so that's the big challenge now, is like we're trying to repair pieces of the system that got eroded when these folks kind of started taking over some of the business.
So this is very interesting because from a distance, the issues for many of us didn't even appear that complex
Hmm.
as it relates to the sort of sequencing and how the streaming services, from my perspective, it just seemed like a money issue. Like, oh, you're not getting paid as much as you should. But what you're saying is because the business model has changed,
Hmm.
they're basically getting similar kind of work product in less seasons, and shrunk these kind of like
Mhm.
super episodes, what have you. So this is very interesting, and we're talking to Jorge Rivera, who's part of the Writers Guild
Mhm.
of America Writers, and is one of the labor leaders from our perspective anyway, maybe not formally in some level, but as a spokesperson, but certainly someone on the front lines of this. So Jorge, at this point, what briefly, besides getting paid, what are you all proposing to resolve it? Because on some level, the structure of the way they do these shows is not changing. It seems like kind of shorter, more highly produced, seasons is kind of the trend, with especially with a lot of these genres on streaming
Mhm.
services. So how are you all proposing to address this in labor negotiations?
Yeah, I think again, to go not to go too deeply into it. There's maybe a half a dozen things that have changed in the last 10 years or so that we kind of need to address. I think first of all, I think one thing that I often like to bring up and remind people about or educate people about it, because I don't think a lot of people realize this, is like I want to bust the myth of there's this myth that everyone in Hollywood is super rich and owns a mansion. It's absolutely not true. Like, I don't know a mansion. I live in a one bedroom. I live in a one-bedroom apartment with my wife and my dog in downtown LA, and and we're making ends meet, but we're not starving. But some people are. Some people are having a hard time paying their rent, and it's true that there's a small percentage, your Steven Spielbergs of the world, your George Lucases of the world, your Angelina Jolie's, Brad Pitt's, the A-listers. Yeah, yeah, they're making tons of money and they have houses in Malibu. Sure. That's a very small percentage. That's maybe 5%, 1%, something small. I don't have an exact figure for you. But the grand majority of people who work in this industry, including writers and directors and producers and actors and crafts people, people who do all kinds of putting if you look at the credits at the end of a show or a movie, there's 300 people listed. They all have very highly skilled uh, positions that they play, and those are all working class, middle class people. They're if they're lucky, they can afford to buy a house and put their kids through school. So I think that's a myth that I think everyone should set aside, because that's the majority of people who work in the industry are just normal, everyday middle class people with kids and bills, and so those are the people that are really in this fight right now. And to get more specifically into the things that have changed, like I said earlier, 10 years ago, the grand majority of the jobs that were out there were on broadcast. 22 episodes meant you worked all year long. You got a weekly check all year long. And if you wrote an episode or two a year, you also got paid a script fee on top of that. And you had money going into your health insurance fund. And also you were getting paid residuals, which meant, if your episodes got reran, like wherever in another part of the world or another part of the country, you would get a check for that as well, and that those checks would be healthy enough that if you weren't working for some reason, like if you were in between jobs, it would sustain you.
Mhm.
That was the normal run-of-the-mill landscape 10 years ago. This nowadays, you have streamers don't pay residuals or pay very little residuals. Like, I don't know if you've been looking on Twitter, but people have been posting some of their residual checks for episodes they worked on, actors, directors, and writers. And some of them are like literally 3 cents, $4, something insane
Yeah.
like that. And instead of
Now,
22,
are those for residual checks for like old TV shows that you could watch on these
yeah,
platforms, or new stuff that they're producing?
it's old stuff. Residuals,
Okay.
usually the check comes from like a year later, when
Yeah.
your episode, after the first airing of your episode, it's gotten played again in reruns, or people on the streaming platforms, people watched it after the initial drop, years later or a year later or whatever. um so though the, the model for calculating residuals is either non-existent or very, very broken, because those checks on broadcast would be several thousands of dollars. You know, you might not be working 1 year, and because like that's the other thing. It is a gig economy to a certain extent. Like it's not like you're working like in the regular world. You might get a job somewhere at some company, and you might be with that same company 10, 20 years. That doesn't really happen with television, because basically your employer is the show.
That's right.
And sometimes a show will go 10 years, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes a show will go 2 years, and then you could be out of work for a year before you get another gig. That's very common. So residual checks for the person who's in between gigs, kept them afloat, and also help them pay rent and health insurance and all that. But so now residuals are non-existent. You were getting residual checks that used to be a couple $1,000 are now like 4 cents. And
Jorge,
then
let
yeah,
me, if I could just come in, one of the
yeah,
things that's been really interesting watching, following you, and I encourage people to follow Jorge Rivera, kind of chronicling this whole situation, what's going on, and kind of being there, right on the picket line, if you will, is that you've really taken a lot of leadership in supporting and highlighting the diverse communities, right, that are part of the larger writing community,
mhm,
and making sure their voices heard, kind of during this strike, and their
mhm,
some of the y'all's distinct needs. Now, this is also tied into the bigger questions around diversity in Hollywood and kind of getting things made that reflect our stories. So, what would you like to share in terms of uh, any challenges specifically to diverse writers, Latino writers, Puerto Rican writers,
yeah,
that are bubbling up that you've tried to highlight as part of this larger strike? Because I see you with the API,
yeah, mhm,
pickets, and LGBT pickets, and obviously the Latinx ones. So I would
yeah,
imagine y'all have some distinct challenges as diverse writers in this whole
sure.
situation.
Yeah, well, I think the guild during a strike negotiation and during a contract negotiation and during a strike are basically going after issues that affect all writers. Like it's an egalitarian um, organization. So when they go to the table, it's not specifically saying we're looking at this particular thing for Black writers and this particular thing for Latinos and this particular thing for women.
Mhm,
They're looking at things across that affect writers across the board. That being said, many of the issues that are on the table are felt the strongest by underrepresented groups. Like we are underrepresented groups in general. We're talking women, disabled, LGBTQ, older writers, people of color, disabled. I said disabled, older writers. We're often the ones that get hired the last, and often ones that get let go first when there are budget cuts. So many of the things that I've been talking about, the whole issue around residuals and short orders and mini rooms and budget cuts in general, are resulting in smaller rooms. Like you used to have like 10 people for a writer's room. Now maybe you have 6 people in a writer's room. And instead of having a full cross section of lower, middle, and upper level writers, meaning people with upper level people being people with more experience, and lower levels being people who are brand new, and the middle, people who are in the midpoint of their careers. Like instead of having a full cross section, now you're having 6 writers, whereas maybe and that makeup of the room is basically a lot of upper level writers, which excludes a lot of lower level writers who are people of color and from underrepresented groups starting out. So
mhm.
like the jobs are shrinking for people of underrepresented groups. And also when we talk, if we want to get more specific for Latinos and Latina people, we're unfortunately it's the numbers are crazy here. So let me break it down for you. Like we are the biggest ethnicity of the country outside of non in the non-white category, right? Whites, Anglos are the biggest ethnic group, and then it's us. 20 almost 20% of the population. And in Los Angeles alone, if you talk about the city about Los Angeles,
Ah,
Latinos make up 50%,
yeah.
you know, of the population. But we're hired behind the camera at the lowest percentage rate of almost all the underrepresented groups. Like for example, in television alone, we're hovering around 9%, which is almost half of the national average, whereas Anglos are being hired above national average. And not to say that's not to disparage our Anglo allies, because there's plenty of them. There's plenty of very outspoken people who are non-persons of color who are very much trying to help us change the situation. I think it's just a systemic bias that's inherent in the system. Like we all have biases. You have biases. I have biases. We can't help it. That's how we're human beings. We're programmed a certain way, but we're often not thinking about those biases when we're making decisions. And I think what happens is, like, within the system, people from underrepresented groups are not getting hired in positions of power, positions of decision-making power behind the camera, or even on the executive level at, development executives and creative executives across the board. So what happens is that, we're not thinking about consciously. Some people are, but most of us aren't thinking consciously about those choices. And how it ends up being is that people from underrepresented groups are just getting hired across the board below their national averages. So, and the thing is, like, Latinos, like I said, are 50% of Los Angeles, 20% of the country. We hold like $1 trillion in buying power in the US. We're the highest group of consumers of media. We're one of the highest, largest subscribers to streamers. So it doesn't make sense. It's really mind-boggling. And so, like, yeah, through my work with the committee, the Latino Writers Committee and the Latinx Writers Committee, and the other committees, the Guild has a department called the Inclusion and Equity Group, and under that department, there are about 12 committees, all of them sort of focused on different advocacy and underrepresented groups. So there is a Latinx one, there's a Black Writers Committee, women's, Asian, disabled, as LGBTQ. So, like, we all work to do work, Native and Indigenous. There's a bunch of them. I'm always forgetting all of them. But anyway, the point is that we're all doing work to try to help our particular communities, but also we do work together. We, hold events and mixers and things like that to sort of like present our members opportunities and to cross pollinate, to sort of like uplift each other. And that's why you see me at a lot of the other pickets, because those are my committee compadres, and I'm there to support them, not just their committees but their communities. And there's a lot of solidarity within that sort of cross section of the Guild. There is an issue, and we're all trying to solve it by uplifting each other and sharing opportunities and making opportunities for each other.
Absolutely, and we're talking to Jorge Rivera, a very vocal Puerto Rican writer and producer that's been very involved in the Writers Guild of America strike, and is
Mhm.
really giving us kind of a breakdown of kind of what's at stake from a labor perspective, kind of some of the misconceptions of everyone living large out in Hollywood, and the distinct challenges of diverse voices in the arts and trying to get
Mhm.
our stories told in this ever-changing dynamic. We haven't gotten into AI and how that's going to
That's a
potentially
big
change.
issue.
That's a big issue, and I know that's part of your labor negotiations. When we come back, Corey, we're going to take a quick break. I want to want people to check out some highlights of some recent episodes, including my recent interview with Philly hip hop artist who's also my little brother, Planetary from the hip hop group Outer Space. He just released Jorge's fifth album. It's actually his first
Awesome.
solo album, and actually he actually this was spurred on by Netflix actually using one of his songs from 20 years ago on the Kobe documentary. So there's a little
Okay.
connection there with you all. And also we're gonna hear part of my conversation with Joe Perocala about Bad Bunny's epic appearance at Backlash and with the WWE on the island a few weeks ago, and my regular host, the legendary freestyle artist Betty D from Sweet Sensation, sharing a little bit about her personal history and how she started and the impact she feels she makes as a freestyle artist for our community to this day. So we're going to hear a few updates. And when we come back, we're going to ask Jorge, you know, even once we get past this strike, this issue around elevating Latino voices, telling
Yeah.
Latino stories, with this ever-changing media landscape isn't going away, and I want to get Jorge's thoughts on that. Definitely support, follow Jorge Rivera on Twitter, and we come back, we'll continue this conversation on, kind of the Puerto Rican perspective, if you will, or a Puerto Rican perspective on the Writers Guild strike and kind of how we move the ball forward on diversity inclusion in the arts. We'll be right back here on Bomba Live, the talks you've been waiting for your entire life. So you always knew you had an eye for talent.
Yeah.
And how did that impact just you as a person to be around that kind of artistic energy?
It became my life. I mean, it just wasn't any was. Once I got into that world, I never left. I'm still there. Everything I thought I was supposed to do, I didn't do none of it. I was like, do I do this? Do I go to school? I just wanted to, I just want to be a creative. I don't want to really.
Let's be honest about it. How much Música Urbana, el movimiento reggaeton has done for our community? How many kids it's kept off the street? How many mouths are getting fed? How many businesses have grown? How is it expanding the Puerto Rican influence in every way, bro? I mean, people in all over Latin America, all over the world use Puerto Rican slang. You know what I'm saying? Like, the political impact, Ricky Renun.
Started when I was 17 years old. So essentially I went to, I was on tour as a young girl. I grew into adulthood through freestyle music. And not only did I do that, I did that with fans who did that with me. So I still am in touch with fans that I have been friends with, went from fans to friends to family even since 1986. So it gives me a purpose. It gives me a purpose and a sense of pride to be able to share my culture, my music, my personality, myself, my love, everything with the fans that I think of this genre that are just the most amazing fans.
Welcome back to Bomba Live, the talk show you've been waiting for your entire life. And next time you're on the show, Harry, we're talking a little freestyle. I know Jersey City guys know a little bit about club music, brother. So great to talk to you here. We're talking about
I used to be a hip hop independent producer. That's how I got my start in television, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I even go even further back. I was in a rock band called Bay of Pigs in the 90s.
Okay, I remember that name. Sure.
Yeah, we were Latino. Kind of like a grunge rock band. It was me and my brother, two Puerto Ricans, a Dominican singer who had pipes like Chris Cornell, a Cuban guitar player, and a white dude on drums. But
nice.
We played like it was like a Soundgarden meets Santana kind of vibe.
Nice. Wow. Yeah. We have to definitely follow up and have that conversation. That is really interesting. Well, that's so Jersey. That's very brand, Jorge, for Latino Jersey guys to get into the rock. And a lot of people don't realize a few members of those classic kind of 80s, 90s Jersey bands were, some of the musicians were Latinos. Yeah. Tico Torres and a few of those guys.
Yep.
So there were definitely by that as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Jorge. Really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to ask you, I know we're in the midst of the strike, and at the end of the show, you're going to give people ways people can follow up and identify ways to support the strikers, because that's not over. But I'd be remiss if not asking you, kind of like, in this moment in history, we are in flux because on some level we're making kind of historic strides. I mean, and we can point to certain examples of either people getting an opportunity to produce shows on even platforms like Netflix, and some really interesting stuff from Hentified and a few other things I can think of that have really been groundbreaking over the last year or two. But I don't know, and I spent a fair amount of time in LA. I'd love to connect with you next time I'm out there. I don't know a creative in LA that's really happy with the situation from our community, because you just spoke about the numbers nationally, locally. I mean, it's criminal, historically, how especially the Mexican American community has been sort of invisible in Hollywood, considering the historic nature of that community being Latino. You didn't even get into the fact that our buying power, I mean, we're 1 in 5 of everybody, but we're at least 1 in 4 of all the movie ticket buyers. And I can't believe we're not over indexing on it. I know I have every freaking streaming platform, like I don't know a Latino that's not addicted to this stuff. So I know that we're also extreme consumers and supporters. And so, just any thoughts you may have for our audience that's yearning for more stories, yearning to hear more, and watch stuff that you produce and people like you produce, that, what's your thoughts around kind of how we're moving that ball forward in 2023?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, outside of the strike, I'm have my fingers in a lot of those conversations. You know, yeah, we shared all those numbers and percentages of you know, how large our communities is, and so it seems like crazy that we don't have more content that speaks to our culture and to who we are and our identities. And then we have, you know, the problem of when we do get stuff on the air, like you know, it gets sort of doesn't get the marketing it's supposed to get, and doesn't get the viewership it's supposed to get, and so often things are canceled before their time. A prime example is, you know, the Gortita Chronicles, which unfortunately is mind blowing to me. Like, it got such great reviews,
Yeah.
people loved it, people were watching it, and it was one of the first things to go with the rebrand or the restructure of, you know, WB, along with, you know, the Batgirl movie, which never even saw the light of day.
It was a Latina, it was Dominicana, right? That was the lead
Yeah,
on
yeah.
it? Yeah.
I forget her name, but she was the actress that was also in The Heights.
I think it was Leslie Grace. Wasn't it Leslie
Yes,
Grace?
Leslie Grace,
Oh,
exactly.
Bachatera, yeah, yeah. She's
Yeah.
very talented. Yeah.
So, you know, it's hard to explain. We don't. Everyone is scratching their heads why this happens. You know, and it's not just us. You know, we see it with other underrepresented groups too, struggling to get content that kind of represents them on the air. You know, I think again it goes back to the systemic biases and you know, the industry being very risk adverse and trying to, you know, do things that are safe. And I think also partly our community is a little tricky because even though, you know, we all fly under the same banner of Latinidad, we are, you know, from 20 different countries, and we do have some cultural specificities that are, you know, a little different from culture to culture. And so it is kind of hard to me. Like, I think what the industry tries to do is a one size fits all kind of thing for everyone, and it just doesn't
Mhm.
really work for us that way. You know, not everyone's going to show up for One Day at a Time because they may not see themselves represented in that, and not everyone's going to show up for Vita, and not everyone's going to show up for Hentified. But you know, I think I think the industry has to stop thinking that way. You know, that we're a one size fits all, that we're a monolith.
Or that
And
everything has to be like this tremendous smash hit. You
yeah,
know, I mean, I think
exactly.
about talk about one thing fits all. Like, I mean,
Right.
do I have
So,
to see
like,
yet
you know, like,
another coming of age product about Boston white guys? I mean, you know, you
right,
know what I mean?
exactly.
Like, you know, like we don't have a problem recycling that stuff.
That's a great point. Like, you know, they can be 12 doctor shows featuring white folks in it, but like if we have one, we can't have a second one, and we can't fail. You know, like other, you know, non people of color shows, like no one questions that.
No,
The amount
and
of
the thing, if I could just add to that, that you know, also it's how the goalpost is placed as ways to how do you consider success or failure, right? So, like,
yeah,
I don't know all the numbers identified, but part of the theory of Netflix and these streaming services is that you're supposed to throw a lot of different content on here, and
mhm,
not all of it's going to be Game of Thrones. You know, but what you want to do is produce content that a niche that different niches are going to feel so strongly about that they're willing to pay the monthly fee just for
yeah,
those set of content, right? So, you
yeah,
know, and I know,
exactly.
you know, and I know that some of the products you talked about, Gentified Vita, they may have had different niches in the Latino community, but they had very passionate fan bases to this day.
Yeah, and it's worth servicing those audiences. I think, you know, like the way things are thought about these days, it's like everything has to be a massive hit, otherwise it's not worth doing. And that's not from the writers community. That is, you know, those are the studios thinking that way. You know, so I don't know. We have certain challenges. We do. I think the key to it is just to keep moving forward and keep trying to put stuff out there. Like, you know, there are hundreds and hundreds of Latino writers out here, you know, trying to make that happen. And I think they just have to keep pushing forward because it's just a matter of time for things to change. And the other part of a big piece of the puzzle for me is, and I'm learning this, is that, it's not only just the creatives, the writers, directors, and actors that need to sort of keep pushing forward and infiltrate the industry. It's that we also have a big problem on the other side of the desk of the executives. There aren't enough executives with green light power from these underrepresented groups, from the Latinx community and from the Black community and from so on and so forth, all the communities I mentioned earlier.
Jorge, briefly, no, that an ownership, and that's a conversation we frequently have on here on the show in a lot of contexts, whether it's entertainment or status issues related to the island, and
Mhm.
just kind of like how do we take ownership of our community and our futures collectively. Jorge, I'm curious, how'd you get in the game, man? This is not a very common career track for a lot of
Yeah.
folks, and so I'm just curious if you had a brief story you want to tell in terms of like how you got involved in this incredible industry.
Yeah, I mean, let's see. So like I mentioned earlier, I started out as a musician. I was in a band. And that band lasted like maybe 8 years or whatever it was, and it kind of fell apart. But I stayed in music after that. I started producing hip hop, and then I started um, scoring for short films and independent films back in Brooklyn when I was based in Fort Greene,
Okay.
and through my scoring of films, I connected with a few friends that were really encouraging about my own writing, and I was interested in writing something. And I ended up having a nightmare about one of my hip hop. So I was producer. I was producing hip hop, independent hip hop, and I had one of my clients, or he was a friend, MC, had led a kind of very kind of precarious lifestyle, partied a lot. And then I had a nightmare where he was a cannibal and I was his next meal. And I woke up and I wrote down this idea, and it became a web series about a hip hop MC who was a cannibalistic serial killer. And it was called Rhyme Animal. You could probably find it on YouTube. And that was the first thing I ever wrote. And I really, there was something immediate about writing, producing something, and having it played in front of an audience that really spoke to me. And little by little, I started doing more writing and more producing and less producing of music. And I came out to LA and got my first job was in true crime. I did a bunch of true crime shows as a producer. I got into the Fox Writers program, and then that's the thing that kind of kicked me off in scripted. But it was sort of I came from music, right? Creating music for hip hop mostly.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
definitely got a connection with my brother and his network, and
yeah.
I'm sure if we sit here, we probably are more connected than we even realize. That's
Hmm.
fantastic. Ori, we definitely want us to continue to support all of your projects. Obviously,
Hmm.
support from a labor perspective, the writers, which we know are definitely sorely underappreciated in the industry, and the more and more I think I was aware of this issue, but I didn't realize how drastic it was and
Hmm.
how severely underpaid now, more underpaid and more challenging it is with writers' rooms, as you were saying earlier, getting smaller and series and opportunities getting, timelines getting shorter. Let people know. We're going to put it on the screen here, but
Yeah,
let people know how people can kind of follow what you're up to and how
yeah.
we can support the Writers Guild of America, particularly the diverse membership in this ongoing labor situation.
Yeah, yeah. Those hashtags, WGA Strong and WGA Strike. If you follow those, you'll see thousands of tweets by people who are on the front lines of the pickets. And some of them are very, very educational. Like some of them get deep dives into what the different issues are and why people are striking and how hard people are having a time financially. There are people who are taking second jobs to pay their rent because they're not being hired enough and paid enough. Um, and it is a very, very frustrating period of time. Like, it used to be a time when writers did pretty good and made decent money and were able to do all the things that most people want to do, the American dream, which is just have a family, buy a house, take a vacation occasionally, have health insurance. And it's been almost impossible in the last 8 years or so to do that. It's been the streamers have really changed the landscape, and it's kind of a critical moment right now. And again, like, going back to the whole myth about everyone in Hollywood rolling in the dough. It's just not true. Most 99% of the people that work in Hollywood are middle class people, and they're having a really tough time right now. And the thing is that what's amazing is that you could see the support from other unions. Like, people are starting to realize that and see what we're doing. We're basically fighting the fight that everyone has been wanting to fight for a while, which is corporate greed. Like, corporations are sinking their teeth into every aspect of life these days, and they're making it unsustainable for the average person.
In this case, art is life is imitating art in
Mm-hmm.
some sense, right? And it's interesting, and we've chronicled this certainly with our political coverage here on Bomba Live quite a bit, Jorge, over the years, is that it's no coincidence, let's be honest about it, that labor, the power of our labor movements and labor rights has dwindled as our labor pool has gotten more diverse.
Mm-hmm.
And if there was a time, Jorge, probably when we were smaller, but not
Mm-hmm.
ancient history, where
Mm-hmm.
labor was incredibly strong in this country, if not the majority of a high percentage of workers across the country, not only were part of unions, but very strong unions, as you just laid out.
Mm-hmm.
And that is through politics and a lot of different societal factors, particularly corporate greed. Those rights have been whittled at for a few generations now, and now we're seeing to the point that people said, I mean, there's more content being created than ever before, and there's a market for everybody. There's niches. There's all kind of opportunity. It seems like this should be a golden era so that everyone can get
Yeah.
paid and all voices can be heard. And that's not happening, and that needs to be addressed. So we really
Yeah.
appreciate your leadership in this area. Jorge, I want to remind people that are listening to this, you want to follow hashtag WGA Strong, WGA Strike, and hashtag WGA Strike 2023. Jorge, any final thoughts here on this very informative episode of Bomba Live?
Yeah. No. I guess the final thought is that like I mentioned earlier, I think our fight is the fight that we're fighting, a version of the fight that everyone needs to fight across the country. I think corporate greed, Wall Street, is the mechanism that drives Wall Street is constant growth, right? Constant growth, profits, 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 exponential growth of profit. But the thing is that that's unsustainable, and the ecosystem can't handle that. I think the crazy thing is that the for example, with WGA, what they're asking for, if we were to get, it's really just 2% of the overall profits. Like, there's a meme going around on Twitter that adds up all of the salaries of all of the top 8 entertainment executives, and if you add that all up and you divide that in half, it's almost exactly what we're asking for. That would cover all of the demands for the WJ for 3 years. So if that small piece, and it's like, it's really a drop in their bucket. And if we were to get that, the whole ecosystem would be a lot more healthier. So they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot, cutting off their own nose to spite their face. Like, if they just were to give that little piece up, we'd be much healthier economically. They would be much healthier economically. Everybody would be much healthier economically. So it's really insane that the position that they're taking is what it is. And again, they're losing like $30 million a day. We've already surpassed the money that we're asking for if you add up all the money they lost since the strike started. So how does that make sense?
That is unbelievable. Jorge Rivera from the Writers Guild Writers Guild of America West. We're going to continue to support you, brother, and definitely between hip hop and LA, and we definitely got to keep in touch, and we definitely want to we support the artistic community here, the entertainment community, and sort of, I mean, that's a big reason why I do the show, to be honest with you, is that we need more platforms like this. And in our case, I think English speaking Puerto Ricans, we have a lot to say about all these things, and we want to bring a lot of different diverse voices to the table here on Bomba Live. Gracias, Jorge. We're gonna end the show with a clip from a previous episode where we highlighted some other content creators, documentarians from the documentary Calle de la Resistencia, related to some of the activism post Hurricane Maria on the island. And again, continue to follow Jorge Rivera on Twitter. Thank you so much, hermano. We'll be in touch.
Muchas gracias.
¿Ustedes cómo puedes explicar un poco sobre el momento histórico que estamos en Puerto Rico después de huracanes, terremotos, una revolución política, y cuál es ¿qué significa para ustedes como creadores de películas, gente que hace medios, en contar esta historia y también mostrar la cultura y los artistas de Puerto Rico?
Wow, qué pregunta.
Significa un mundo entero, porque significa que estamos poniendo nuestra historia puertorriqueña y lo que nos está ocurriendo como pueblo al frente, in the forefront, para que continuemos hablando acerca de lo que está pasando, porque para nosotros Puerto Rico es importante. Milton, no sé si quieres añadir. Significa un mundo, por lo menos para mí personalmente, poder contar una historia que es importante para Puerto Rico y que cuenta básicamente todo el sufrimiento que hemos tenido